So as Mei-Lin mentioned, I'm Joanne Halpern, the director of the Hasso-Plattner Institute in New York. And we are delighted to continue the North America segment of our global design thinking journey. Our next two speakers, whose work has had quite an impact on New York City, are Karen Bhatia and Oscar Romero. Karen is the Senior Vice President of Tech at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. She's also co-founder of Stanford Startups New York. So she's been really working at the intersection of technology and entrepreneurship and has been instrumental in helping businesses start and scale. She's also implemented many programs for inclusive economic development in New York City. And in her talk, Using Design Thinking to Create New York City's Tech Strategy, AI as a Case Study, Karen's not only going to discuss the role of design thinking in developing the city's tech strategy, but also how design thinking can be the process and the solution. She's going to conclude her presentation by sharing with us what she's learned and she and her colleagues have learned from this process. So Karen, the floor is yours.
So today, as Joanne mentioned, I'm going to be discussing specifically how in New York City, we're developing our tech strategy using design thinking. And I'm specifically going to focus on our development of our strategy around artificial intelligence. First, I want to start off by telling you a little bit about the New York City Economic Development Corporation and our work. We're considered the city's engine for economic development, and we're responsible for making sure that across the 5 boroughs, New York City is at the front of ensuring that there's workforce development and entrepreneurship, small business opportunities across New York City. And we do this in various ways. Some of our projects include development across Times Square, as well as the growth of Cornell Tech at Roosevelt Island. One of the areas that we focus on is industry development in New York City. And the area that I'll touch upon is how we use technology for economic development purposes. Specifically, my role is looking at how technology is specifically a tool for economic development. Now, what do I mean by that? As Mei-Lin had mentioned, during the course of this past week and during the course of this past year, the world has suffered through a tremendous pandemic, through a lot of different effects of climate change, as we were just discussing earlier in our small group, about the devastation that a number of these hurricanes have caused over the course of this past few days as well. With all of this in mind, it's resulted in a tremendous loss in regards to economic impact in the world and in the United States as well. As a result of that, we've been looking into, and even prior to that, how can different industries actually be a catalyst for resiliency? And what we've seen over the course of the past year during the pandemic is specifically that tech has actually driven our recovery. Over the course of 2020, tech was actually a catalyst for a tremendous amount of salary increase as opposed to any other industry in the United States and specifically in New York City. That's one of the reasons why we're looking at tech as a tool for economic development. What we've seen in the New York City ecosystem is that over the course of the past decade, the number of startups that we have in New York City and the number of incubators that support these startups have increased dramatically. We focus on tech development because of the entrepreneurship and small business opportunities that it affords New Yorkers. We've seen a tremendous amount of growth in venture capital funding, and we also have the industries in New York, such as finance, insurance, real estate, healthcare, that serve as customers for our tech enterprises. We also have a very strong workforce in New York City. Over the course of the past decade as well, New York City government has been supporting entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color and women-owned businesses. We have the academic institutions in New York City to support this workforce development around tech. And what we've seen is that we have over 355,000 people in New York City's tech workforce. So we see this incredible opportunity to make sure that tech is one of the drivers of our economic resiliency and economic growth, but we want to make sure that underlying this is not only our emphasis on entrepreneurship and about opportunities around workforce development, but also thinking about who are these opportunities for, keeping very much in mind what Mei-Lin had just spoken about, which is the divide. ensuring that there's equity across the board and that New Yorkers across all of our 5 boroughs have opportunities as entrepreneurs, have opportunities in tech workforce too. What we've seen is that in the workforce itself, within technology, of these 355,000 jobs and growing, there are a number of accessible jobs. For example, computer network specialists, only about 54% of them have bachelor's degree. There are a number of opportunities for those who do not have opportunities within higher education. There are also similar opportunities in other areas like marketing, consumer services, customer relationships, data analyst types of programs. And we've also seen that not only are these jobs accessible, but they're also provide stability, long-term growth opportunities, and increased salaries. Even for those without a bachelor's degree in New York City, they're working within the tech sector. They generally make about 80% higher in terms of salary compared to those that do not. These are some of the fundamental reasons why we're thinking about tech as a tool for economic development. Now, fundamental in all of this is making sure that we're also thinking about, as Mei Lin also said, what exactly are we creating? What are the types of services and products that we're actually helping to support with these technologies? And keeping in mind, of course, equity principles, who these technologies are impacting, who they're not impacting, and who has opportunities within these areas. This is fundamental to why we're doing the kind of work that we're doing. Now, our tech strategy is actually premised on the design thinking process, using an entire holistic approach, making sure that we have an interdisciplinary group of people who are examining from end to end, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What are the opportunities that we see within it? And I wanted to emphasize that this process is something that we've been going through when we're thinking about what exactly we're going to be including in our tech portfolio. When we're examining specific tech subsectors like artificial intelligence, which I'm going to be emphasizing here, that process is actually part of examining what are the problems and opportunities within artificial intelligence. And within this discussion today, I'm actually going to focus on ethics and concerns around ethical implications around artificial intelligence and how not only design thinking has been a part of the process that we've used in coming up with our portfolio, the subsectors we focus on, as well as the problems we want to address, but design thinking has actually been part of the solution. So our process of stakeholder engagement has included, attending a lot of different meetups and conferences to engage with those within the tech community, specifically around artificial intelligence, continuing to make sure that we have a lot of interviews, we have roundtables with people across industry, across entrepreneurs, investors, and making sure that the public is engaged through civil society groups, nonprofit organizations, and also ensuring that government has a representation through lawmakers, policymakers, and regulators. We also conducted a significant amount of outreach across the world, speaking about best practices and learning from other cities as well as other countries. So just to start off, when we're thinking about our tech portfolio, and again, thinking about technology through the prism of economic development, one of the areas that we look into is what are the growth in terms of jobs within these different subsectors. And as you can see here, nationally in the United States, artificial intelligence job postings is pretty significant. And specifically, when I go into this focus in New York City, we've seen an incredible amount of job opportunities, as I mentioned, job opportunities that are also accessible, thinking about marketing and sales opportunities, data analytics opportunities, as well as those that are more high tech, thinking about programming and data science. In 2018, there were over 11,000 job postings for artificial intelligence in New York. And we also heard that a significant number of companies and industries that New York City is known for, such as finance, retail, automotive, as well as healthcare and manufacturing, these are all areas that are integrating artificial intelligence more and more in their work. So in our process of analyzing what are the opportunities and some of the significant challenges in growing the AI sector and thinking about it from an equitable prism is looking at a variety of personas. We were thinking about what is industry mostly concerned about? What is our finance industry concerned about? Real estate, healthcare, or manufacturing? What are entrepreneurs in AI concerned about? And what are the opportunities? Also, our workforce. And finally, thinking about the public. What is civil society mostly concerned about, and where are opportunities for them? In this process, using design thinking, some of the areas that we'd identified and we heard consistently is that one of the biggest areas of concern was about the ethical and regulatory frameworks and lack thereof when it comes to AI applications. Now, this was areas of concern particularly to industry, to workforce, as well as to the public. When we're thinking about AI applications, as Maylin had mentioned, there could be significant downsides and disparate impacts to AI applications. There are no industry standards. There are also a number of tools and services that need to be developed and adopted. And practitioners, students, as well as those within the workforce, are not aware of what these different ramifications are and tools that they could have at their disposal to actually address them. This is the area that I'm going to focus on to actually double down on and indicate to you what we've done, both by using design thinking as a process, as well as design thinking as a solution. Other areas through our process of looking into artificial intelligence and using the design thinking process as well to double down on what are the areas of biggest concern around artificial intelligence growth in New York City is data access, lack thereof, particularly when it comes to financial data, healthcare data, other aspects of this tremendous commodity that entrepreneurs use. How do we make sure that there's access to these types of resources, data resources, but we're making sure at the same time there's privacy that's being kept in consideration, security that's being kept into consideration, and also thinking about mitigating risks when it comes to competitive advantages to those institutions that might be sharing this information too. So our thought was, how do we make sure that we're providing access, mitigating the downsides, but also creating frameworks by which we're able to streamline the process by which those that need access to data can actually get it. And finally, what we were hearing consistently, especially from industry, entrepreneurs, and the public, was the need around innovation, making sure that larger companies as well as entrepreneurs were addressing issues of concern, thinking about AI applications when it comes to the public good. How are we able to help companies get access to innovation, help entrepreneurs innovate, and make sure that whatever it is that they're actually producing in terms of services and products themselves are for the public good. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be doubling down on the first issue, and that is the ethical concerns around artificial intelligence. Now, going back, what we had mentioned is, how's artificial intelligence and the growth of artificial intelligence an area that poses itself as an economic opportunity through entrepreneurship, through workforce development, and through the products and services that are created. And what we've seen, this figure here is adopted from AI Now, is that there are tremendous concerns around AI. We've seen over the course of just a period of 1 year, all of the different concerns, highlighting some of them, including how a flawed AI application in the UK was actually used to deport thousands of people erroneously. We've all heard about Amazon's facial recognition that wrongly identified 28 US lawmakers, and we also know about issues around facial recognition and how it disproportionately misidentifies people of color as well as women. And we also saw instances in where the Department of Housing and Urban Development in New York filed a complaint against Facebook for violation of their Fair Housing Act in terms of using their algorithm on Facebook to target certain people for advertising purposes around real estate. So in New York City, what we decided through our process of identifying these barriers and the different personas that we mentioned were what are possible solutions. We iterated around that, brainstormed around that, and came up with 4 that we tested. The first one is thinking about an applied research lab. Our initiative was going to be a physical space, a New York City Center for Responsible AI, that would focus on a type of sandbox, this first prong that you see here. It would focus on actual pilots where AI applications were going to be developed, whether they were industry applications, government applications, but it was going to be a system by which we were going to be incorporating ethics and specific ethical concerns in developing those AI products and services. And the outcome of this is, how do we make sure that they're best practices and tools that we can learn from these actual pilots? Other areas that I'm going to touch upon are, again, focusing on data sharing. How do we create data collaboratives and platforms and technologies by which we have repeatable best practices and tools to actually help different companies, governments, as well as entrepreneurs share data and making sure that they are private, secure, and also mitigating risks and downsides. We also were focusing ultimately on an AI for Good program, thinking about the use of artificial intelligence when it comes to healthcare applications, mobility, urban tech applications, financial inclusion, and finally focusing on education and training. And one of the aspects thinking about responsible AI is making sure that our workforce, as well as our students, learn about the impact of ethical implications, bias, issues of how do you explain AI as they're developing AI solutions as well. How do we make sure that they learn about different tools and practices and processes in order to make sure that they're incorporating this perspective as they're developing applications? So as I mentioned, I want to hone in on not only artificial intelligence and the process that we use to identify the biggest barriers and the biggest opportunities for the various personas. Of these four solutions that we came up with and tested, I want to focus on the first one, which is this applied research lab. This applied research lab, as I mentioned, would actually focus on specific pilot projects. As I mentioned, there could be commercial applications through companies, let's say like insurance companies, government applications like police departments, or actually think about opportunities by which you have regulators who could focus on particular ways in which they could test out future regulations around facial recognition technology or other types of technology that they are thinking about setting certain laws around. So within this sandbox, and this sandbox is I think, an interesting example of how design thinking could actually be used as not only a process, but as a solution. So one of the biggest concerns that we had was that across industry and across government, they shared a lot of the same concerns. For example, in the insurance industry, how do we ensure that there's explainability, that you're able to explain how a decision was made? So for example, let's say an insurance company is thinking about ways in which their AI application is making decisions around who's actually going to get coverage and their amount of coverage. What we would do is get together in this sandbox a group of interdisciplinary perspectives. We'd bring together industry, the insurance industry, lawyers, civil society, making sure that the public has a place in expressing their concerns, in expressing opportunities, how they're also impacted, making sure that regulators and policymakers are at the table, and making sure, of course, that we have tech experts as well. Other areas in other disciplines could also include psychologists too, economists as well, thinking about the implications of any artificial intelligence application as it's being developed. So the goal is, let's say in this hypothetical, you have an AI application in which an insurance company wants to use this tool in order to make quicker and more efficient decisions around making sure they're identifying who can get coverage and how much they can get covered for, as well as any kind of payments that are going to be needed to made by that particular customer. So the idea is to have this sandbox of interdisciplinary perspectives, analyzing the entire process from end to end of that AI being developed. And the goal of this sandbox is to develop a repository of tools and services so that others within the industry, other insurance companies, whether it's thinking about automotive insurance, healthcare coverage, whatever that is, if they're mostly interested in, let's say, addressing issues of bias or addressing issues of explainability, identifying how a particular decision was made, they could use the learnings from this particular sandbox to look at the tools and services and the best practices that are being developed. And another outcome is focusing on case studies. so that others can learn from the documentation of what this process was and what the biggest learnings were. So within this sandbox and this interdisciplinary group of people, this solution would focus on this process. And that is, once the pilot is actually selected, going through, just starting on the right here, is this group questioning, who's developing this model, this AI application? What are the inputs? Why are these the inputs? For example, there have been criticisms in the past about insurance company actually using past credit scores to determine whether or not people would get access to insurance, and also what their coverage could potentially be. People would question, how does this have a disparate impact on those that are poor? Should this actually be an input in determining who has access to insurance coverage and what their co-payments would be as well? Next, the whole process is actually thinking about the data as well. Not only the model, but questioning, where's the data coming from? Is it representative of the population? Is it over-representative of the population? Is the data secure and private? The whole goal of this process in this sandbox itself is to understand, to observe, to make sure that this interdisciplinary group of people are coming up with concerns and solutions, and with this brainstorming of potential solutions, making sure that we're prototyping, testing, and asking questions about ultimately who's impacted by the AI application, and is there a disparate impact? All of this would serve to help with the learnings and to iterate, to make determinations as to if there are any changes that need to be made with the model, with the data, as well as looking at this cycle itself. Some of the learnings from our use of design thinking to create New York City strategy, as well as design thinking as part of our solution, was in the first place, a critical aspect is thinking about who are the decision maker. Who essentially decides what are the problem and topics and projects that are going to be selected. This is an incredibly important point when it comes to thinking about ultimately what are the problems that are going to be solved for. What are we actually putting a spotlight on? And secondly, also, how are the decision makers making a determination as to who is invited to participate, who's invited to provide their input as well, who's welcome and part of the, welcome to the table. This emphasizes the need for interdisciplinary groups of people, not only who are part of roundtables and in our sandbox itself, but actually who are part of the project team. It very much underscores the need for having diverse groups from various racial, economic, disciplinary backgrounds, geographic backgrounds as well, having that representation in order to make a lot of these decisions. These are critical even before the design thinking process starts. Secondly, one of our big learnings is actually how do we empower participation? In the instances in which I spoke to you earlier about making sure that civil society is able to participate and we have public participation to provide input as to what their experiences have been in that particular AI application that they've been using, whether it's policing or, again, access to some sort of a product like insurance. What are their biggest concerns? How are they affected? Can people actually participate in this type of learning and input giving? And in some instances, there might have to be some sort of compensation for participation for their time. In addition, acknowledging that their knowledge is incredibly valuable, but oftentimes we have to make sure that whether it's the public or whether that it's government, and we've seen this also when it comes to policymakers, making sure that there's a base level of understanding. When we're talking about the digital divide, making sure that any kind of misperceptions about what exactly artificial intelligence is and a lot of the scare that is associated and fear that's associated with it is actually addressed. What do we mean by artificial intelligence? What do we mean by your data as well? Making sure that we're addressing some of these issues. And finally, thinking about participation requires some basic tools, and that is access to the internet, especially over the course of this past year. If you do want to engage in any kind of design thinking process, participation requires fundamental levels of access, and that includes access to tools such as broadband. These are some of the learnings that we've had over the course of the past several years as we've been developing New York City strategy, specifically around artificial intelligence and thinking about this sandbox, about AI applications as they're being developed and learning from those as case studies to develop best practices. And during the course of this past year, during the pandemic, what we've seen is that a number of resources in New York City have had to actually go in other ways in which we're thinking about the economic recovery. So this current project is on pause right now, but we're looking forward to continuing it in the near future. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to Joanne.